Chairperson, as workers and families across the state, they're only too well aware of the cost of living crisis and that it's far from over. The rate of inflation has eased, but prices haven't fallen, and costs remain far too high for many households. For so many, wages have failed to keep up with rising prices, and households have tried their best to adjust their spending. But many of them, as we read in today's papers, have fallen into real hardship. 1 in 8 can't even pay their energy bills. People don't expect the government to shield them completely from every single price increase. But nor do they expect the government itself to make matters worse by increasing prices. And that's exactly what we have in this Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael government. And that is what we are debating here this evening. A government that plans to hike fuel prices twice next month. It is simply a reality, Minister, that many workers and families, whether they're travelling to their place of work or for a hospital appointment or to leave their children to school or to visit a loved one, in many areas they have no option other than to use a car. According to AA, the price of petrol has increased by 16 cents compared to August 21 and diesel by 21 cents. And in the past number of weeks, the cost of fuel has steadily increased, not just because of the market, but because your government has increased it on the 1st of September. Households are seeing this at the pumps and they're feeling it in their pockets. So on the 1st of September, Minister, you as a government, in your wisdom, decided to increase the price of petrol at the pumps by 7 cents per litre, and you hiked up the price of diesel by another 5 cents per litre. So we're now seeing prices creeping up to the €2 per litre mark. And this price creep is happening as households continue to grapple with all of the rest. The high energy bills, the soaring mortgage costs, the unaffordable rents and the unaffordable childcare fees. And despite these pressures, what's the government determined to do? You're determined to make matters worse. Because what you plan next month is not 1 but 2 tax hikes on petrol and diesel, pushing petrol and diesel prices up for workers and for families. And this government will push the prices higher on the 11th of October and again on the 31st of October. On the 11th, the government plans to put up the price of petrol by 2 cents and the price of diesel by 3 cents. On the 31st of October, you plan as a government to push up the price of petrol further by another 8 cents per litre and the price of diesel by another 6 cents per litre. And you've legislated for all of this. It's now already law. So taken together, the government's drive to increase fuel prices will add hundreds of euros to travel costs of households per annum, pushing fuel prices closer towards the €2 per litre at the pumps mark. So workers and families will rightly ask themselves why. As the cost of living remains so high, this government is determined to make matters worse for them, to make the school run more expensive, to take more money out of workers' pockets as they travel to work, and to increase the cost of citizens who visit their loved ones. In March, I warned the government that these rates of tax increases needed to be kept under close review as the risk of further price rises at the pumps remained a real prospect. The government didn't heed that warning, so it is time that they do. The government needs to change course, and that's what our motion calls for. You need to understand the financial pressures households are under and scrap your out-of-touch plan to increase petrol and diesel not once but twice next month. So this motion calls on the government to scrap their plan to hike the price excise on petrol and diesel first on the 11th of October and again on the 31st of October. Both planned pricing hikes must be scrapped. So workers and families, Minister, continue to struggle under a cost of living crisis, and the government should be supporting households, not making matters worse. And that's the simple thing about it. If you understand where people were at, you would understand that many are pushed to the pin of their collar and sitting round the cabinet table, you have decided to launch 2 tax increases on petrol and diesel on workers and families across the state. Minister, I tell you, what workers do not need is the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael petrol and diesel tax hikes. What they need is a break. So I'm calling on you and all deputies here to support Sinn Féin's motion before the House this evening.
5 minutes. The motion we have here this evening before us is about giving people a chance in the most difficult of circumstances. And I'm calling on TDs across the constituencies, across the North West and the border constituencies particularly, which have a particular problem in regard to this because of the issues with the 2 jurisdictions being so close to each other, unfortunately. to support this motion, and for government to support this motion, for government to recognise that this is a situation you simply cannot stand over. We cannot have a situation where people who are under so much pressure are looking at a further increase in fuel costs in October of this year. We've seen the people at the gates today in regard to childcare and the costs there. Every day there's something else. Every day people are feeling the pinch all over the place. We see interest rates going up. We see the price of rent. We see the price of, obviously, fuel and heating oil. Everything that people are buying is going up, 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 up. And this is an opportunity for government to have a little bit of solidarity with people and say, look, in the circumstances, we recognise that it is not appropriate to bring in these increases, and in October to withdraw them. So I'm asking you, Minister, to ensure that you do that government step back from this and scrap these proposed increases. Yesterday, yes, it was yesterday morning, we were in Donegal where we met IBEC and a lot of the businesses in the border region. And one of the big issues we have in the border region is that we have two jurisdictions right beside each other. And for filling stations all along the border, they're looking at a situation where already we have fuel in the north that's parity or maybe a little below, and they're afraid that if we continue to see fuel rising in the south, you're going to have more and more people crossing the border, and that is actually going to close those businesses. So, we have to recognise that government has a responsibility to ensure that we can keep businesses like that open, that we can ensure that the price of fuel is adequate for people to be able to manage so that they can do their ordinary day's work, that they can go out and bring their children to school. There's also, of course, the issue for the delivery of goods around the country, so much of which is done in the white vans to our shops and all of those places. All of these fuel increases have an impact on that and have an impact of the cost of living further down the road. So, Minister, what we need to see is action from government. We need to see action which will actually make a difference. Now, in October, you have the opportunity to scrap this particular price increase that you're looking at. We're not saying, that you need to scrap all of them. As time moves on, if the price of oil on the international market comes down, we have to look at that as things change. But at the moment, things have changed in the opposite direction. It has gone up. And if you bring in these price increases, we will see fuel prices probably going over €2 a litre. And people simply can't afford that. And you need to recognise that. And you need to cut your cloth to the measure to ensure that you can deliver something for the ordinary people out there who are working hard, who are getting up in the morning, who are trying to go to work, who are trying to manage, and many of whom who don't have any other options. Certainly in many parts of the country, as indeed the Caherlock will understand, there is no public transport. There is no way of doing it. We don't have the rail, we don't have the Luas, we don't have anything else to bring us to work. People have to get into their car and drive. And for many people, the continued increase in fuel costs is having a really detrimental effect, because every time they go to the pump and put in whatever amount they normally put in, maybe it was €30 a year ago, now they have to put in 50 to get the same distance. And that's the reality that people are looking at. So, Minister, our motion is very clear. Don't bring in these increases in October, and have a little bit of solidarity with the ordinary people out there who are doing their best and who are suffering so hard because of the continued cost of living crisis that we have across the country. So, I hope that you will see sense, and the government will see sense and recognise that this is not the time to increase fuel prices for people out there.
So, Minister, I just want to reaffirm the points that have been made by Deputy Doherty and Deputy Kenny. And as you know, I'm a TD also in the same region as both of them. And you will know the huge public transport deficits that we have in the region. The reality is that if you are working, if you're studying, if you're trying to run a business, public transport sadly isn't an option for most people in our county. You have to have a car. The electric infrastructure just really isn't there. It's not a possibility. So, if you add on, the whole issue of carbon tax that is supposed to punish people for not taking better alternatives. Well, in places like where we're from, you don't have those alternatives. They're not real alternatives around you. If you look at, it's not just in isolation that these increases are there. You add them on to energy costs, electricity costs, food increases. The people that we represent, everywhere they turn, they're getting squeezed. People are really struggling and making tough decisions, in terms of their lives. With this issue now, it's dread, when you talk to these families, when they're looking at that petrol pump and it's going up and up from week to week, up and up, back up towards that level, that dreaded sort of €2 level again. So we're appealing to you to listen to us, particularly from the parts of the country where we come from, around the border, rural areas where people have to get by, and this difference, is huge for people. People, say to me, they hear about reports about, surplus and full employment. We've never had it so good. That's not what they see in their lives. That's not their lived experience. What they see is that they just can't make the numbers add up every week, and all of these components together. So you have it in your power in this issue here not to make that even worse. So we are appealing to you to support the motion, support the call that we're making, and to try and do what you can. Obviously there's wider issues, but we're focusing on this one tonight, and we're saying to you, hear what we're telling you, and do what's right.
Quinlivan.
Minister, the cost of living in this state has spiralled out of control. For many workers and families, despite being on a wage, they are struggling to get by, bill by bill, week to week. With the near continuous news of further price rises, it is all but impossible for the average worker to have any disposable income. Those that are renting face the ominous threat of eviction, and if they are to seek newer rented accommodation in Limerick, the cost of renting is beyond the reach of most workers. For a family renting a 3-bedroom house in Limerick, the average cost is $1,699. For a single person renting a 1-room apartment, it stands at $1,177 per month. I'm sure you'll agree these are colossal prices to be paying for rented accommodation. Those who are fortunate enough to own their own home have seen their mortgage interest rates rise, in some cases 10 times this year, and rise further, and now they face these additional fuel costs. In Limerick, there are some fantastic companies who are large-scale employers. I think the likes of 3 Ireland, Johnson & Johnson, Edward Life Sciences and Regeneron, amongst many others. These companies in the main are based in industrial estates located near the suburbs of the city. Whilst there are bus services, they're infrequent and unreliable. The morning and evening traffic in the likes of Castletroy and Raheen is testament to the growing number of commuters travelling to these locations for work. Commuters, many of whom are renters, who are also paying over $1,100 per month, and their rent can't afford any new costs. These workers and families have seen the price of petrol and diesel increase in the past months, and are told this is a necessary cost due to rise further. Between March and August, the cost of petrol and diesel has risen by 7.6% and 9.9% respectively. There was a 7 cent and a 5 cent increase on the cost of petrol and diesel started this month, with further increases scheduled for the 11th of October for 2 cents of petrol and 2.5 cents for diesel. Yet another increase scheduled then for the 31st of October of 8 cents per petrol and 6 cents for diesel. This has placed an unnecessary further burden on workers and families in the state. It is placing an unnecessary burden on those who have no option but to use their car to travel to work, school or college. You must realise that pursuing these increases at this time of increasing cost of living chips away further at the income available to families. It chips away at disposable income. The fuel price increase on their own will add hundreds of euros in annual fuel costs for workers and families, and yet you persevere with this regardless. People will be faced with the prospect of paying nearly €2 per litre when they fill up their vehicle. I urge you to stop this increase scheduled for the 11th and 31st of October, and I urge you to stand up for the average worker and family like we are trying to do here tonight.
Ryan.
I'm here today to speak to Sinn Féin's vital motion of reversal of planned fuel prices increases, and I'd like to thank Deputy Doherty and his team for bringing this to the floor at all. Rising petrol and diesel prices are adding increased stress on families during the cost of living crisis, Minister. Workers are struggling to afford the fuel to get them to work, not to mention students and their families with long commutes to and from schools and universities who can barely make ends meet. Having already added 7 and 5 cents per litre in petrol and diesel on September the 1st, this government plans to add insult to injury by adding 2 increases of 8 and 6 cents by the end of October. Minister, these planned increases bring the average cost of petrol per litre to almost €2 and diesel around €1.90, heaping more and more misery on families and workers. Of course, let us not forget haulage firms and service providers that are the backbone of our economy. Their businesses will be in dire straits with these increases. I and my staff are getting calls from local hauliers and businesses facing enormous struggles to keep people in employment due to rising fuel costs. As you are aware, Minister, this has a knock-on effect on our local economy. increased food costs and adding to the ever-increasing overheads that many small and local businesses already face. In my own constituency of County Kildare, people do not have the option of public transport. And Minister, all previous speakers have told you this, and will have to rely on cars to get around. That is the reality of rural Ireland, Minister. Sinn Féin have been calling repeatedly for government action on fuel costs to aid struggling families and businesses. Well, I have news for you, Minister. Fuel prices increases will make things worse, not better. You know that, and I know that. Government must reverse its plans to increase petrol and diesel prices on October the 11th and 31st and stop adding to an already crippling cost of crisis. It's the worst cost of living crisis we've ever had, and you're sitting there thinking it's okay to add more to it. I urge the Minister and his government to adopt the Sinn Féin motion and change tactic on this issue. Thank you, Count Corley.
Thanks, Count Corley. Minister, we need to see action from this government as soon as possible on the cost of fuel and the cost of living. Sinn Féin have constantly raised this issue here in the Dáil. All this government is doing is driving people into poverty. Do the government actually realise what people are going through during this cost of living crisis? The rising cost of fuel is not an isolated issue. It is part of a broader cost of living crisis that is sweeping across Ireland. The cost of rent, housing, food, utilities and other essentials are continually on the rise. The cumulative effect of these increases is putting immense pressure on families across the country. Tell you about one of my constituents who contacted me a couple of weeks ago, and she was refused the school uniform allowance for her child after being means tested. She is on invalidity pension and her husband's wage put them over the limit. But they're living hand to mouth with the rent cost, which was not taken into account, along with electricity costs, food costs, fuel costs to keep their car on the road. They couldn't figure out where to get the money from to purchase their child's uniform. Around the time of being means tested, their account had 87 cents in it, until her husband's next payday. Her husband is paid monthly, and after all their bills are paid, that's the standard amount that they are left with in their account, 87 cents each month, Minister. As we head into winter, people are going to have to start putting oil in their tanks again to heat their homes. This is another bill for people already under huge financial pressure. Older people afraid to turn on the heat because of the cost, going around their own house with a coat and a scarf on them, or going to bed in the middle of the day to keep warm. Definitely not the way to be treating our older people. While at the same time, this government plans to increase the price of petrol and diesel twice in October. Ordinary workers and families can't afford these hikes in the middle of a cost of living crisis. These price increases, if they go ahead, will add hundreds of euro to average annual fuel costs. That is why you must reverse these planned increases. Our Minister, do you really know what is going on the ground and how people are struggling? Thank you.
Mr. Chambers, I understand you have an amendment to move. You move the amendment, yeah.
Thanks, Cian Corla. I move the amendment, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss the Sinn Féin private members' motion on the reversal of scheduled increases in carbon and non-carbon fuel taxation, and in particular their view that the 11th of October carbon tax increase and the 31st of October 2023 fuel excise restoration should be cancelled. And I'll speak to the government's counter motion, in particular set out that the budgetary context is the appropriate place for discussions around this to be addressed. The government is acutely aware of the impacts of energy price inflation and the broader cost of living crisis on households and businesses across Ireland, and has acted decisively to lessen the financial impacts across the economy and society as a whole. The drivers of inflation are global in nature, and accordingly it is not possible for any one government to fully absorb the costs. Therefore, government policy has focused on temporary and targeted measures aimed at the most vulnerable. The policy response has also been designed to avoid generating second-round effects that could lead to an inflationary spiral. The final retail price of fuel is determined by a number of factors, including the cost of production, distribution, global market factors, international exchange rates, taxation, wholesale market contracts, as well as individual retail pricing policies. In this regard, the volatility in the market which we have faced in recent times is best illustrated in the price of crude oil, which has had a divergence in price of $100 over the period July 20 to May 23. The Government is very aware of the severity of the financial impact that fuel price increases have on Irish households, and I will shortly outline how we have responded. And it is clear, however, that many of the factors influencing the current price of fuels are out of the Government's direct control, in particular the market volatility. This is demonstrated by the fact that while the price of crude oil fell back for a period earlier this year, market dynamics have once again begun to drive its price up again in recent months. Let me now turn to the Government's response to the increase in energy prices over the last 18 months. Notwithstanding the restrictions of the Energy Tax Directive and the need to manage the public finances, the Government has acted decisively on the energy crisis. We have recognised the impacts of fuel price increases. While these trends are driven primarily by global factors, the Government made the decision to alleviate some of the impacts through the domestic taxation of fuel. In particular, in March 2022, the Government provided for temporary reductions in the rate of non-carbon excise applying to diesel, petrol and marked gas oil MGO. Following extensions and amendments, cumulatively these reductions amounted to 21, 16 and 5.4 cents per litre for petrol, diesel and MGO respectively. Following the Government decision of the 21st of February 23, a phased restoration of these excise rate reductions were legislated for, which provided for reintroduction of full rates as follows. The 1st of June, a VAT inclusive increase of 6 cents on petrol, 5 cents of diesel and 1 cent on MGO. 1st of September, VAT inclusive increase of 7 cents on petrol, 5 cents on diesel and 1 cent on MGO. And the 31st of October, a VAT inclusive increase of 8 cents on petrol, 6 cents on diesel and 3.4 cents on MGO. The excise reductions to date are designed to strike the balance between passing a significant benefit to consumers while managing the tax base and respecting the minimum rates allowable under the Energy Tax Directive. They are estimated to have cost over €1 billion in terms of revenue foregone to the Exchequer between the 10th of March 22 and the 31st of July 23. In addition to the fuel excise reductions, the Government has made substantial fiscal support available to assist with the cost of living challenges, amounting thus far to some €12 billion. €3 billion of cost of living measures were introduced prior to Budget 23, with Budget 23 reflecting a cost of living budget focused on addressing inflationary pressures. And I reject some of the remarks being made by others as if this Government has stood idly by and done nothing for households. Can you not recognise the significant intervention that was made, and some of which was proposed by yourselves in the context of the overall cost of living crisis? Not 1 ounce of credit or acknowledgement of that in any of the contributions made thus far. The budget package amounted to €6.9 billion, which included over €3 billion in direct measures to address the cost of living challenges, such as adjustments to income tax bands and increases in social welfare payments. This was complemented by a set of one-off cost of living supports introduced in the final quarter of last year, worth over €4 billion. The Government recognises that there continues to be upward pressure in fuel prices due to a variety of geopolitical issues. However, it does not believe it is appropriate to respond to this situation simply by accepting this motion. Instead, the Government is of the view that Budget 2024 is the appropriate place to strategically set out its taxation and expenditure decisions in response to the cost of living crisis currently being faced by many households. And simply accepting dull motions on any given week isn't the way to set out the wider fiscal parameters, to set out the wider certainty for households and what supports we will be giving in terms of responding to the cost of living crisis that many households are facing. And that will be set out on Budget Day. Deputies will be aware that the 2020 programme for Government committed to increasing the amount that is charged per tonne of CO2 emissions from fuels to €100 by 2030. The Government followed through on this commitment by introducing legislation, the Finance Act 2020, to provide for a 10-year trajectory for carbon tax increases to reach €100 per tonne of CO2 by 2030. This measure is a key pillar underpinning the Government's climate action plan to halve emissions by 2030 and reach net zero no later than 2050. A further key component of the government's carbon tax policy is the hypothecation of revenues raised from these rate increases to fund important just transition measures. And it's important to note that a significant portion of carbon tax revenue is allocated for expenditure on targeted welfare measures and energy efficiency measures, which not only support the most vulnerable households in society, but also in the long term will mitigate fuel price impacts by reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. In the long run, the best way to protect Ireland from the impact of international fossil fuel prices is to reduce our dependence on them. We will achieve this through the progressive decarbonisation of Irish society and through steps that will be taken to meet the government's commitment to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. For context, it must be noted that changes to carbon tax increases are having a relatively small impact on current energy prices. The 2023 carbon tax increase, which came into effect in October last year for auto fuels, added approximately 2 cents per litre in tax to petrol and diesel. The increase in rates for home heating fuels such as kerosene, gas and solid fuels was delayed until the 1st of May 23 to mitigate against impacts during the winter heating season. The May 23 increase added approximately €21.56 to a 1,000 litre fill of kerosene and 20 cent VAT inclusive to a 12.5 kilogram bale of briquettes. And it is clear, therefore, that carbon tax itself is not the cause of current energy price inflation. In conclusion, the government is very conscious of the negative impact that the sustained rise in consumer prices is having on society. Everybody in this House is aware that the reason for this significant inflationary pattern is because of matters completely outside of our control and of global in nature. And the government is satisfied that it is responding in a proactive manner and in line with policies taken in many other jurisdictions and within the constraints of the EU energy and VAT directives. We believe that its comprehensive response to the energy crisis and in other areas we will be in a good position to recover when hopefully the current price pressures on fuel begin to ease. The government is putting forward a counter motion on the reversal of these planned increases, and we believe that all of these matters, which will receive the appropriate attention, as I've said, and will set out the strategic fiscal parameters of the state, it's more important to address that in the context of Budget 2024 as part of overall taxation and expenditure decisions in response to the cost of living pressures being faced by society as a whole. And we've been very clear in the summer economic statement and that there will be a cost of living package for families and there will obviously be significant decisions on expenditure and tax which are there to help households, support them through the winter period, and that's the appropriate place to make that intervention and support for families. And I've outlined earlier why the government believes the carbon tax is important to also reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And I'm reminded of, I think, the Sinn Féin manifesto where you had outlined your opposition to carbon tax, but you had also outlined your ability to spend the tax increases that were occurring. So I'd encourage you to maybe provide a bit of clarity on that. Consequently, we cannot propose a proposal to reverse the October 11th increase, which forms part of the long-term policy trajectory of increases and policy approach agreed by government. If the government were to do this, it would undermine the rationale of this important measure to mitigate climate change. As I've said, we're putting forward a counter motion on the matters raised, and I think the appropriate place to provide the important supports and cost of living measures that I think families and society and businesses will expect in Budget 2024 is for Budget Day. And we appreciate your input on that, but the appropriate place to do it is then and not as part of the motion.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now we go to Deputy Desi Ellis, who's sharing with Deputy Crowe, Deputy Brown, Deputy Maiden and Deputy O'Murrough in that order.
Minister, your government has announced planned increases in fuel prices that will only exacerbate the already burdened pockets of ordinary workers and families across the country. Petrol and diesel prices have experienced a steady rise since May, but it's the recent sharp increase that will have a significant impact on the pockets of the public. These planned increases come at an untimely moment when individuals are still grappling with economic uncertainties caused by the global pandemic. Moreover, many people rely heavily on personal vehicles for commuting purposes, making them highly vulnerable to rising fuel costs, forcing individuals to bear this additional financial strain. It's not just unfair, but causes unnecessary stress given the current cost of living crisis. The proposed 10-cent increase per litre in petrol and 8-cent increase per litre in diesel will push these fuels closer to the €2 litre by October's end. Such a steep hike will undoubtedly impact individuals' budgets significantly, particularly those who rely on their vehicles for work or essential travel purposes. The overall cost of living will rise as transportation costs trickle down into other sectors, such as food production, small businesses, and even public services like healthcare. Higher fuel prices can also prove detrimental to various sectors, such as transportation, agriculture and small businesses. Transportation costs will escalate substantially, increasing expenses throughout supply chains. Farmers who rely heavily on machinery powered by diesel engines will face higher operational costs, which may result in decreased agricultural productivity or increased produce prices for consumers. Small businesses that depend on regular deliveries or transport services may struggle to absorb elevated transportation expenses without passing them on to customers. These planned fuel price increases are not only untimely, but also a burden on ordinary workers and families who are already facing economic challenges. The consequences of these hikes range from increased living costs to negative impacts on various sectors of the economy, and they should be scrapped.
Minister, I think there's clearly we have a different perspective in relation to the challenges that are facing people. Many people would say to us that they're facing into a financial cliff, and they're getting nearer and nearer to that. You seem to be, and your government seem to be, have the position that you're steaming on ahead, clearly powered by hot air in relation to your policies. So you're saying to us that we have to, and families that are out there that are suffering at the moment, the key element of this is that there's going to be 2 increases in the month of October. You're saying, let's wait till the budget process. We're already in the budget process. Every day we're contacted by families and individuals and advocacy groups and all the rest about the crisis that they're facing, and that we're already in the part of that. The budget is being written as we speak, but what we're saying at the moment is that families can't handle another 2 increases in the 1 month, and that's basically what the elements of this is saying. Petrol and diesel prices have already been increasing steadily this year. We know that. Like any of us that travel, we know that. But the difficulty, what we're saying, Minister, is that while people maybe living in Dublin have an alternative, that there might be transport, and that's not always the case in everywhere. If you're going to a job, in many cases, you need that transport. So what we're saying, Minister, is this has to stop. You have to wake up to what families are facing, and they're facing a crisis. So we need to do more, Minister, and what we're asking you to do is do the common sense thing and stop this increase. Is that too much to ask? I don't think it is. I don't think, anyone that's listening at home, the governments are saying that there's plenty of money in the thing. Is it about this thing that, the higher the increase that people aren't going to get into their cars? There's no one sitting outside their driveway driving, revving up their car a couple of hours a day and all the rest. They're using that petrol, they're using that diesel to get from A to B. And people are suffering and worried, really, and worrying and going to bed at night, wondering how they're going to get the money to get into their job. And it's not just workers, it's students, it's people going for childcare and so on. So, do we have to, do an ABC stuff here, Minister? There's a problem out there. It can be solved. You have it in your power to do that, and we're appealing you tonight in this motion to do just that, to stop the increases. I'd ask you to reflect on that. Good morning.
Minister, just so you won't be too upset by what you're listening to from this side of the House, we'll give you credit for one thing. You have given payments to families, but what you gave on one hand, you took back twice as much on the other. The 3 parties in this malfunctioning government have really lost touch with the pressures that people are really under out there right now. And things are bad enough right now. Inflation has increased to an extent that for many, work, even those that get up early, as you keep talking about, it doesn't pay the bills anymore for them. We've had childcare providers outside the gates today who are working on fees that were frozen at last year's rates in order to get core funding. Many of those businesses are now under undue pressure because of the impact of inflation since then, and many are going to go out of business. We have community workers in the area of health and social care who are the backbone of Tipperary and who are due to go strike next month because they have been left behind by the government who failed to address the disparity in pay they experience. They are calling for you to take action on their behalf, not to make matters worse for them by hiking the cost of motor fuel any further than you already have. What about the many mortgage holders who are paying vastly more each month alongside the increased cost of virtually everything, and you think it's all right to put more pressure on them? Food is up, energy is up, the number of electricity customers falling into arrears is up, yet you think these people can afford to pay even more to put fuel in their car so they can drive to work, put in their day's work, drive home, and at the end of the week or at the end of the month see a vastly devalued paycheck go into the account to pay out even more at the pumps. By the end of October, you'll have increased the price of petrol by 10 cents per litre and the price of diesel by more than 8 cents per litre, pushing both closer to €2 per litre. And now we're facing the onset of winter. People will need to put more money towards heating their homes. But the truth is you're making it even more and more difficult. Let me warn you this, Minister, that it will have an effect. And I remind you that whatever one-off payments you may include in the budget will for many be offset by the hikes you intend to impose on people throughout the month of this October. And the longer you are in government, the worse things keep getting for those struggling with the cost of living. And there's only one thing for it, and it's time for change.
I'd like to amend Pearse Doherty's motion to all the TDs across the House, especially to my fellow TDs from County Wexford. The Minister of Finance urgently needs to reverse the planned decision to raise petrol and diesel prices in October this year. These purposely risen price increases will add to the already substantial living costs to ordinary families. Wages have stagnated. Food inflation is running at 6.6% and rising. Rents on year in my own county has increased by 19.5%, and fuel inflation is running at 16.4%. That's even before the government planned 2 increases in October. It is plain as day that it is getting harder and harder for families and workers to get by. Most are living from week to week. Hiking the cost of fuel will have an immediate effect of increasing prices across the board. Everyone knows these planned increasing costs will be passed on to the consumers, one way or the other, whether through transport or delivery costs, etc. This will add hundreds of euros to the average family budget and wipe out their disposable income. And God help you if you live in rural Ireland, as these increases will have a disproportionate unfair increase compared to the rest of the population. The fact is there is no alternative to using your car in rural Ireland to go to work, to school, to your local sports club or leisurely trips. Small farm holdings are faced with huge extra costs. Now, the government say they acknowledge that they are at a cost of living crisis. However, one of their solutions is to increase fuel prices. How can this be so? It is a total contradiction. The government must realise that people are at the edge of managing their incomes and salaries. People are on fixed incomes, pensioners, care workers, apprentices. And what's more, they cannot keep absorbing the current cost of living crisis. Small family businesses are closing every day due to our energy costs. However, Minister, there is still time to do the right thing. What the Minister can do immediately is cancel his plans to increase the price of petrol and diesel on the 11th of October. Cancel his plans to increase the price of petrol and diesel on the 31st of October. And if you truly want to help the cost of living crisis, then cancel this unnecessary burden and take it off the shoulders of ordinary workers, of men and women of this country, and give families a break.
Second step, words of wisdom.
That's all I'm going to need. That's it. Look, in fairness, it's already been said, Minister. The fact is, what you're doing here with these increases in October is heaping pain on pain. Look, we can go through whether we're talking about the childcare workers, whether we're talking about people under pressure that haven't got any sort of plans from yourselves yet in relation to dealing with mortgages, dealing with rents, whether we're talking about the cost of shopping, whether we're talking about the CRU that doesn't even want the powers to be able to deal with the madness that you're dealing with in relation to energy providers. But really, you have an opportunity here where you can at least mitigate some of the pain they're dealing with, because the fact is we can talk about fossil fuel replacement, but the fact is we don't even know how that Res 3 auction is going to go at this point in time. The government really need to get get its act together in relation to that. But let's be real. People are under severe pressure. You can help them out now. You need to make sure there are no increase to the cost of petrol and diesel, because people don't have a choice. They need to get in their car, and you could help them to make that slightly cheaper, slightly easier to deal with the cost of living crisis.
Deputy Nash, please.
Thank my constituency colleague for his contribution. I'm pleased to speak on this motion on behalf of the Labour Party. Now, listening to some commentators, Minister, over the last few days, one would think that the cost of living crisis is more or less over. But nothing could be further from the truth, especially for those who are living in a permanent cost of living crisis. The rate of increase in terms of inflation might be slowing, but it is important to remember this. Inflation was 7.8% measured across 2022. The spike in prices, especially the essentials, was much higher. Now, it might slow to about 5%, but that means that practically everything we buy is costing much, much more than it did 12 to 18 months ago. We have had 23 straight months now where the annual increase to the Consumer Price Index has been at least 5%. And we know, Minister, as you do too, that inflation hits different sections of society very differently. If you're well paid and you managed to save money during COVID, you are generally well insulated. But if you're on a fixed or low income, the last 18 months have been catastrophic. Now, the government's answer for those most impacted by rising costs was below inflation increases to weekly social welfare rates, a below inflation increase to the minimum wage when corporate profits were at record levels, and a series of poorly targeted once-off measures, some of which actually helped to fuel, not tame, inflation. And on this day 2 weeks, this government looks set to make the exact same mistakes again. Social welfare increases that would be too low to restore the purchasing power of pensioners, carers and people with disabilities, and a series of energy credits given to you regardless of what your income is and what assets you might hold, when there are many, many thousands of people across the country who could do with much, much more. On top of this, there are 2 scheduled measures to be taken in October, separate from the budget, that will, as a consequence, see increases to the price of petrol and diesel at the pumps. Now, the motion characterises the increases due as arising from the fact that the government has, and I quote, legislated to increase the price of petrol and diesel on the 11th of October by a further 2 and 2.5% per litre respectively, and further adds that, and I quote again, the government has legislated to increase the price of petrol and diesel on the 31st of October by a further 8 and 6% cent per litre respectively, but the motion is silent on why. It doesn't describe what these increases involve. One, we know, relates to a planned increase in excise duty at a time of high prices, and whereas the OECD has said 2023 has seen the first drop in living standards for Irish households since 2013, I fully expect and would indeed demand that the planned excise duty hike scheduled for next month be dropped. That's a position that the Labour Party would propose and will advocate for. It is within the control of the Minister to do this, to help hard-pressed motorists who are faced with a plethora of charges that they could very well do without, at least for a 6 to 9 month period, and to be kept under review. Now, I'm surprised that the reason for the other increase to be introduced in October has not been explicitly mentioned in the motion itself. I think you referenced it yourself earlier on, Minister. It's to do with the long-planned and legislated for increase to the carbon tax. Now, why did Sinn Féin not say this directly in the motion? I think that's a valid question. Sinn Féin have done it before. They've directly referenced their opposition to carbon tax, as it plays well on the doors. The failure to mention that this is carbon tax, I think, is conspicuous and, quite frankly, suspect. I do detect an effort, this is serious, to hide this and to avoid calling it what it is, because you know fine well, and everybody knows, that Sinn Féin has a very dubious record, indeed, and a very dubious commitment to climate and what's needed to be done to decarbonise our society. Now, Sinn Féin's opposed to any form of carbon tax, and I think that party should just be honest about it and stop squirming and dancing on the head of a pin. That's it, simply put, and avoidance of the term, I think, won't persuade anybody otherwise in terms of Sinn Féin's position on the environment. Now, carbon levies and charges are a vital tool in the armoury in the existential fight against climate change. We simply have to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, and we support the principle of progressive taxes on fossil fuels on the basis that the bulk of the revenue generated must go into supporting those households who experience energy poverty and to support retrofitting and those on low incomes who can ill afford to pay more to keep themselves warm. Now, in our view, all of the almost 10 billion the carbon tax would raise for the duration of the current cycle that we've legislated for should be hypothecated. In other words, it should all go to the fight against climate change. It should all go to social protection, retrofitting and decarbonisation schemes, which would of itself mean that the idea of a just transition would move beyond the slogan that it is for far too many who experience the costs involved in decarbonisation. People who are legitimately and validly scared of an insecure future and a struggle to come to terms with the very real shifts that we all need to make because they feel they're carrying too much of the financial cost of the change. And there's no doubt that increases to carbon taxes can be regressive and can hurt the least well off the most. But they can be progressive when the revenue generated is targeted at those who need the most help. Now, the immediate aftermath of last September's budget, the ESRI's independent assessment using the switch model concluded that the net impact of the carbon tax measures and the welfare measures that compensated for the increase was progressive. Now, the analysis at the time also found that the bottom 50% of households would be better off as a result of the social protection measures that were specifically funded by the increases to carbon taxes. Now, all of this being said, and I said that was the analysis at the time, but things have moved on since then. But all of this being said, we have a huge problem with energy poverty in this country. Now, just listen, Minister, to what Tricia Keelty from the Society of St Vincent de Paul said today in response to figures in Charlie Weston's story in the Irish Independent. 1 in 8 homes are in arrears with energy companies. But let's not pretend and be simplistic about this, and let's not pretend that that's because of carbon tax. It's because of the war in Ukraine. It's because of the way in which energy companies plan and charge for their products and services. It's because we have a crisis of low pay in this country where 1/5 of all workers are merely existing on low pay. It's because too few people get the financial supports necessary to help them meet the bill payments. And it's because the rollout of energy efficiency programmes has been patchy, Minister, at best. And much more needs to be done in Tuesday week's budget to address all of these multifaceted problems for households. And I think a bit of honesty on climate and the environment is required from all of us, and a bit of honesty is required from everyone in terms of what the challenges are, what the solutions are, and the genuine supports that people need if a just transition is to move, as I said earlier on, beyond mere sloganeering.
Thank you, Deputy Nash. Deputy Shortall.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. I welcome this debate on the motion before us tonight. It provides us with a timely opportunity to discuss the measures needed to tackle the cost of living crisis ahead of next month's budget. I must say that I'm very concerned by the signals coming from government, in particular the Fine Gael element of the government, that more tax cuts are on the way. At a time when we should be investing heavily in public services, it seems that this government is instead set on eroding the tax base. This would be a mistake in our view, not least after last year's regressive tax cuts. Most of Budget 2023 was intended to play to Fine Gael's base, and it should not be repeated in a naked attempt to win votes. It was such a poorly targeted budget with, for example, the €600 in electricity credits going to everyone, whether they needed it or not. And I made the point myself that it went to everybody in this House. I don't think that was necessary. I would also say that it went to people with salaries like the salaries of people in this House and much higher salaries who certainly did not need that €600. And it was badly spent public money. It should have been targeted, of course, at those families who most need it. And the other point, of course, about that is that some €12.4 million in energy credits went to the owners of holiday homes. By contrast, the working family payment measures in last year's plan amount to just €4 million. Does this government honestly believe that holiday homeowners are under more financial strain than low-income families? I wonder, do you, Minister? Or are you just trying to buy votes? The weaknesses in last year's budget soon became obvious once the temporary supports dried up and more people struggled to put food on their tables, heat their homes or keep a roof over their heads. Budget 2024 must not repeat those mistakes. While I accept that many of the drivers of rising inflation are beyond the control of government, there are still many measures that can and must be taken to ease the burden on struggling households. And I do believe that the proposed increase in excise duty on fuel that's proposed for the end of October needs to be looked at, because it certainly is one of those measures that the government could take to address the fact that so many families are struggling just to keep their head above water. Even before the current rise in inflation, Ireland's underinvestment in public services meant that services that are subsidised or free at the point of access in other countries, such as health and social care, transport and childcare, must be paid for, in many cases in full, and from people's take-home pay. While a lack of protection for consumers means that many pay very high bills for other basic services like utilities, waste, insurance and broadband, there is no doubt that much more could be done to support families. And of course, we're living in the midst of yet another housing emergency, where households indeed hundreds of thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of households simply can't afford an appropriate home. All of this makes life in Ireland extremely unaffordable. That is why the focus must be on reducing living costs, including the cost of public services, rather than this government's usual focus on giving people a couple of euros a week through small tax cuts. There's no gain for a person in getting an extra fiver if basic household costs rise by more than that. We in the Social Democrats believe that Budget 2024 must strike a balance between providing relief to hard-pressed households and meeting the long-term challenges we face as a society, such as our under-resourced public services and the climate crisis. In terms of immediate relief, there are a number of measures that could be taken quickly by government. These include a reversal of excise duty, for example, on fuel increases, as called for in this motion, and I think that is a reasonable proposal to make. We must remember that Irish people remain extremely dependent on cars, and the reason for this is because there are so few alternatives. Dublin is one of the most congested cities in the world, and many of our other towns and cities are not a whole lot better. In rural Ireland, the situation is particularly bleak when it comes to public transport. The absence of a robust and reliable public transport system continues to be a significant challenge for people living outside of towns and cities. Again, decades of underinvestment is to blame. Instead of funding and delivering public transport programmes, successive governments incentivised the least environmentally friendly forms of transport, leaving people with few alternatives to the car. I accept that radically scaling up public transport infrastructure cannot be done overnight. But, Minister, we have been talking about investing in significant transport infrastructure for decades now. A case in point is obviously the Metro North. Metro Link, whatever you want to call it. We're now on the third iteration of a metro to serve Dublin Airport and all of the neighbourhoods in between the airport and the city centre. I mean, I can remember in the 90s going through the whole public consultation process, all of the documents produced, the applications for planning, the railway order and all of that in the 90s. It happened again in the noughties, 2008, as far as I can recall. And we had all the brochures, all the leaflets delivered, all the engagement by the public and residents groups and so on. And again, no progress made on it. And here we are again, third time round. And now we're being told, at a time when, you know, the coffers are bulging with money that we could invest in capital projects, we're now being told that best case scenario is 2036 for the metro to be up and running. I mean, this is shocking. It is outrageous. We're one of a very small number of countries, of capital cities in Europe that doesn't have a metro serving the airport. Measures, of course, in relation to reducing the cost of public transport and commuting could be done very quickly, and there's no excuse for not doing that. Measures such as reduced off-peak fares, a further cut to regular fares and increased funding for local link would encourage people to leave their cars at home where possible. But for this upcoming budget to have the greatest impact, more measures need to be targeted at hard-pressed workers and vulnerable households. It's time that this government accepted that we have a structural problem around low pay. It needs to take meaningful action about that. We know that around 1 in 5 workers is on low pay, essentially living week to week. According to the Parliamentary Budget Office, between 2016 and 2022, the national minimum wage increased by 14.5%, failing to keep pace with the 22% increase in average hourly earnings. Budget 2024 must begin to bridge this gap and crucially set a clear pathway towards achieving a living wage over the next 3 years. However, this must be a genuine living wage, not this government's interpretation of what that is. Last year, the government announced plans for a living wage that would be pegged at 60% of median earnings. While this may be a step in the right direction, it is not true to the concept of a living wage. That is what it actually costs to achieve a decent standard of living. Median earnings have no bearing on the cost of basic necessities. This government knows that. You've resigned from your commitment to introduce a living wage within the time frame of this government. Next month's budget should also increase support to the most vulnerable households. We must prioritise a combination of core welfare increases to payments such as the fuel allowance, the secondary payments and the qualified child payment, as well as some one-off cost of living measures. Those measures must, of course, be targeted, and you've been advised to do that by all of the agencies working in this area. If this budget is to really improve people's quality of life, then the majority of resources must be shared fairly, and investment in public services is the best way of doing that.
Deputy Pringle, please.
Thank you. I think I'm speaking out of my option out of turn here, but I'm supposed to share time with Deputy Marion Harkin as well, and so hopefully she'll be here beforehand. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today on this motion regarding fuel increases, and I'd like to thank Sinn Féin for bringing forward the motion as well. I fully support this motion and its call for the government to reverse its plans to increase the price of petrol and diesel on the 11th of October by a further 2 and 2.5 cent and by a further 8 and 6 cent per litre on the 31st of October as well. These are increases that are going to severely hurt families and that will add significantly to the current cost of living crisis. They are coming on top of pre-existing price pressures that are hitting every household across the nation, and coming into the winter, anxieties are high, with many households worrying about making ends meet while costs continue to soar. I've had many constituents tell me that they are worried about keeping their homes warm and their cars running. This is particularly difficult for people in rural communities of Donegal, who are disproportionately affected by fuel increases, as the county has the highest rate of forced car ownership due to the fact that the public transport system is only starting now to develop, and people need to use their cars as much as possible. Donegal is a rural and isolated county that is constantly left behind in every area of development, and as a result the county is totally dependent on its road network. I have raised this point many times. However, I will continue to raise it as long as my constituents are forced to worry about how they are going to keep up with rising energy and fuel prices. Hiking these prices during such a difficult time for so many is wrong, and the government's amendment to this motion is completely out of touch, I believe. The statement that the volatility in fuel prices being experienced now and over the last 18 months is due to a variety of geopolitical issues, including the Ukraine war, none of which the government has any control or influence over, completely ignores the role that greed and selfishness has played and continues to play in this cost of living crisis. Nobody is debating that the Climate Action Plan to halve emissions by 2030 and reach net zero no later than 2050 is extremely important, but not at the cost of our citizens. I am very proud to have introduced the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act in 2018, and I understand that the best way to move forward is to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and to prioritise decarbonisation in this country. But there has to be a just transition. We have to ensure that people's livelihoods, homes and well-being are protected in our attempts to combat climate change, protect biodiversity and shift towards sustainability. People deserve to live a life with dignity. They deserve to have a roof over their head, food on the table and fuel in the car. we have the resources to provide that for every single person who lives in this country, while also ensuring that we meet our climate goals. But it requires ambition and it requires structural change. We cannot expect to achieve this without hitting the big corporations that use Ireland as a place to trade, but don't give back fairly to the state. We cannot expect to achieve this while continuing to provide for more and more data centres, which put significant strain on our resources but contribute very little to our economy. It is unfair that rather than targeting these companies, the government continues to put the strain on our citizens who are just looking to get by and live a life with dignity. This government is failing those citizens by refusing to address this cost of living crisis, and it sadly costs lives unless we do something about it. Going into the budget season, I am urging the government to prioritise just transition and to introduce targeted long-term support for the most vulnerable in our society, rather than the money back on the energy bills, which I'm going to talk about again, which is, I agree with Deputy Shortall, is given back to the wealthy, given back to the likes of me and that there, where we don't need it, and it should be targeted at the people who are most vulnerable in this society. It can begin doing so by supporting this motion and ensuring that households have one less worry going into this winter as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Harkin.
Thank you, Can Corla. And excuse me, but I'm after chasing to get here. But first of all, can I thank Sinn Féin for bringing forward this motion to reverse planned fuel increases. Minister, you know that the planned fuel increases are driving up the cost of inflation. So it's not just car owners, car drivers that will feel the pain, it's everybody, because that means the cost of other products will increase. And my question is, Minister, how much of an increase in the Exchequer tax take are we looking at? I mean, if the increase is of the order, because I was just having a quick look at what diesel was about 6-8 months ago, you could actually get it for about $1.50 a litre. It's now, the cheapest you can get is about $1.81, and it's $1.87 in many places. And we're looking at a further increase of 10 cents by the end of October. So that's an increase in the order of 40+ cents per litre. What does the Exchequer get out of that? Would I be wrong in saying, Minister, that the Exchequer will get an extra maybe 20 cents plus per litre or even more than that? I'd be very interested if you could give us that information, because that's a huge haul for revenue and the ordinary car owner is footing the bill. Now, I had a look at some of the stats around car ownership in Sligo and Leitrim, and the most recent ones I could get were that there's approximately 30,000 cars in Sligo and about 15,000 in Leitrim. And the average number of kilometres driven per car per year in Sligo is about 17,500, similar to Donegal, whereas in Leitrim and Roscommon, the average number of kilometres driven per car per year is over 19,000. The state average is over 16,000. So we see clearly from those figures that car owners in rural areas travel significantly longer distances, whether it's to school, to work, to childcare, to access services. So they are disproportionately hit harder, Minister. And we can't say that this is an unintended consequence, because you are well aware of those figures yourself. But Minister, while the impact on counties like Sligo, Leitrim, Donegal, Roscommon, other rural counties is much greater than in the largely urban areas, Minister, the hit along the border is much greater. I've received quite a number of emails, and I'd just like to read a little bit from an email that I received less than a week ago. This person owns a petrol station on the border, and as he said, "As I write, the current average price of diesel is 178.5 cents, that's euro, and unleaded 174.7. That's in Northern Ireland. That's according to the Consumer Council." And he said, "As of today, we are 182.9 cents for both, and with a measly 2.5 cents per margin, which is not sustainable." So this Minister was about a week ago, and we're looking at the guts, as I said, of a 10-cent increase, and they were already 4 to 5 cents dearer. But he goes on to say, any further rises to the carbon duty or fuel duty will close the majority of border fuel stations and lead to further retail tourism in Northern Ireland. Our sales have dropped by 25% volume over the past few weeks already. This is not lower consumption, just consumers heading north to buy fuel. I understand the duty rises are to encourage people to switch to greener options. However, we will see further deprivation in border communities. We call on the government to completely remove the planned rises in fuel duty and also the planned rises in carbon duty annually to give our businesses a chance. At present, he says, we employ around 25 people. These jobs are at risk in one of the highest unemployment areas in the country. Fuel has been now, for a while, the last remaining retail product that is cheaper in the Republic than in Northern Ireland. And he says, with fuel duties and prices rising in the Republic, it will encourage thousands to head north to the likes of Newry, Enniskillen and Derry on a weekly basis to get their groceries, alcohol and now fuel. So, Minister, as I said, it's not just the rural counties that are being disproportionately hardest hit. These increases will be the death knell for many petrol stations along the border. But it's a bigger and a wider issue. People will travel north for their groceries, their alcohol, and now it'll actually almost be worth their while just to do it for fuel. You won't understand that unless you live in a border area, unless you see the circumstances there. And as I said before, you cannot say these are unintended consequences. You know this is happening, and I'm asking you, what are you going to do to see that it doesn't get worse?
Deputy Violet Ann Wynne.
So, Minister, in the last 3 weeks alone, we have had one significant increase in petrol and diesel prices, and we're down the loaded double barrel of not one, but two more increases in just a few short weeks. Now, that may fly in some parts of the country, and I find it hard to believe that voters in the Minister's constituency would be happy about it. But I can assure you, Minister, that for the 36,000 cars and the 4,300 vans travelling to work and school in my constituency of Clare every day. They are absolutely appalled at this measure that I can only describe as out of touch and, again, anti-rural decision-making by government, who seems to be punching down. Minister, as you know, the CSO reported last year that the rate of consistent poverty in the country was in or around 13.1% of the population, and in Clare that represents around 17,000 of my constituents. Hard-working rural people are absolutely fed up trying to put food on the table, clothes on their backs and keep a roof over their children's heads, who feel that they are being repeatedly punched down by this city slicker government. Minister, people are at breaking point, and we know that these increases will undoubtedly cause an increase in applications for the additional needs payments, which will then cause the broken record of those who were rejected and those who are on waiting lists. So I would implore you on behalf of the people of Clare to withdraw this grandstanding amendment and support this motion. This is about more than playing politics, and the stakes are far too high now.
Minister McGrath.
Thank you very much, Ciaran Curley. I want to thank Deputy Doherty and his colleagues for putting down this motion and to afford me an opportunity to further respond on behalf of the government. I know Minister Chambers spoke earlier on as well. And just to set out what our position is in relation to this issue, I believe that Budget Day is the appropriate time for the government to set out its overall response to the cost of living pressures that we know are very real for many households all over the country. The reason that we're here debating this issue is because the government reduced excise in March of last year, and we have had 2 of the 3 phases of restoration completed at this stage. The legislation which is being spoken about this evening was broadly supported across the House. Actually, I think there was a stand-up vote called by our colleagues in the Rural Independents. So the legislation providing for the restoration met with broad support across the Oireachtas. I think that point has to be made. The date for the final restoration of 31 October was deliberately chosen because of the window that we have in the budget to take stock. And that is an opportunity for us to take stock of where we stand with inflation, where we stand with energy prices, with grocery prices, with wage growth across the economy, with the state of the labour market, and we can take account of all of those issues and decide on what is the appropriate collective response as a government on Budget Day, and that is what we will do. And of course, as a government, we are monitoring prices at the pumps. We know the prices have increased significantly in recent weeks because of market forces, primarily decisions by Russia and Saudi Arabia in terms of the supply of oil on the international markets. We've seen Brent crude increase now to, I think, $93, $94 a barrel at this point. Of course, refining costs are also a very relevant issue and consideration when it comes to the final price that is charged at the pumps. And of course, the relative strength of the dollar is also a key factor in that regard. So in the next couple of weeks, I and my officials will be considering all of the range of issues that we have to decide on in the context of the budget. We have a whole plethora of issues across the taxation code, including income tax, VAT, excise, capital taxes, right across the suite of taxation. And we will have decisions to make within the parameters of the budget that we set out in the summer economic statement. And that will be the opportunity for us as a government, and indeed it will be the opportunity for the opposition to set out their response to the whole set of issues, because there's also, as the deputies will be aware, the reduced rate of VAT on household bills, gas and electricity. That also is due to end at the end of October. And again, that is a matter that has to be considered in the context of the budget. So when you are in government, you don't have the luxury of just picking off one issue at a point in time. You have to deal with the totality of the issues that you face, and we will be doing that on Budget Day. And it is my view that in the round, when you look at the decisions that we have made to help people with the cost of living, we have been as fair as we possibly could be. We've brought forward measures totalling around €12 billion since the beginning of last year, a combination of targeted measures and universal measures that I think have made a real difference and have been broadly welcomed and have undoubtedly helped to mitigate the impacts of inflation, particularly for the lower income cohorts, people across society who are on fixed incomes or indeed on relatively modest levels of employment income. And the independent analysis of the response of this government has been that our response has been progressive, that we have provided the most support to those who need it the most. And that is a policy which we will be continuing in this forthcoming budget and indeed in next year's budget as well. So we responded in March of last year to the circumstances that we faced at the time with the reduction in excise, and we set out then a phased restoration. So in total the reduction was 21 cent on petrol, 16 on diesel and 5.4 cent on agricultural diesel. Two of the restorations have taken place. The last one falls due at the end of October, and I and my colleagues will be giving the matter very close consideration over the next couple of weeks. We are seeing significant volatility on the international markets. That's a point that has to be acknowledged. We've pointed that out in the counter motion that we've put forward. Crude oil is an internationally traded commodity. Its price is determined by changing global demand and supply factors, and has had a divergence of $100 over the period July 2020 to May 2023. So it's about striking the right balance, and that's the key challenge that we face, providing an appropriate level of support to households, to businesses in 2 weeks' time, while at the same time ensuring that we manage the public finances sustainably into the future. And we have made decisions that have got us to a point where our economy is now pretty much at full capacity. We have a record number of people at work. We have many households that can absorb the level of inflation that we're experiencing, and many others are under pressure. And that is why, insofar as possible, we have to use the levers that we have available to us to target the resources to those who need it the most. And I look forward, Ceann Comhairle, along with Minister Donoghue, to setting out what we can do. We never claimed as a government that we could fully offset the impact of inflation. We have experienced inflation in the last 12 to 18 months that we haven't experienced as a country since the early 1980s. It has been a remarkable confluence of events and circumstances that resulted in a level of challenge that for many is beyond compare. And that is why the range of interventions that we have brought about have been unprecedented across taxation and across expenditure as well. We are now in an environment that is changing. While there is much uncertainty and volatility internationally, and we are seeing a weakening of the external environment, particularly among many of our main trading partners who will experience little or no growth at all this year or next year. That does have a direct impact on Ireland, a small open trading economy. We have seen our exports fall so far this year, primarily driven by reductions in pharmaceutical exports, because last year was an exceptional year, coming from a lower base in 2021, but 22 is the base, of course, against which current year exports are measured, and also semiconductors. We've seen a very challenging environment in that regard as well. But I'm satisfied as to the overall resilience of the Irish economy. It's borne out by all of the data that I see and my own experience of engaging with businesses from across a whole range of sectors. So we are in a position where we can respond. The public finances are in good health. That is not an accident. It's because of the decisions that we have made over a number of years, and that gives us the capacity to respond and to support people who need our assistance the most. I do have to say, Ceann Comhairle, that we do pay a lot of lip service to climate change in this House, to the need for decarbonisation, to support businesses, support households in their journey to reduce carbon emissions. But when it comes to this difficult decisions about how we fund that transition, how we raise money to tackle fuel poverty, how we raise money to support households in retrofitting, and how we find the money to support the farming community in their journey to reduce carbon emissions, then we can be found wanting. Not on this side of the House. I look forward to what you have to say, Deputy, in that regard. But and I think at least you are honest and say you're against the carbon tax. That's not the position that others in opposition take. They say they support it in principle, but they're always against the next increase, which, when you add it all up, means, in effect, you are against the carbon tax. So there is a lot of lip service being paid in relation to that issue. The government has to respond to the total picture. And that's what we will do on Budget Day. We are engaged in very detailed analysis at this point in time to come up with an appropriate set of measures that does help people, particularly those who need help the most. And the specific issue that is the subject of this motion in relation to the excise duty at the end of October will be considered in that context in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
Yes, brief point then, yes.
Brief to it, that was a State of the Nation address, but I'll be brief. Just Minister McGrath referred to us and the rural independents calling a vote, a stand-up vote, because we had an amendment down to these increases back last early July, and we did push it to a vote, and we did stand, and there was no one on this side of the House to stand with us. There was 5 of us. Right. So, you know, and maybe I talk to Doherty will explain why they're here now playing these games. Well, the last thing the public want out there is shenanigans and brinksmanship and marksmanship and games being played. Deputy, they want relief, not these kind of shenanigans. No, I said it'd be only a minute, and I appreciate that. But they didn't stand up to voters to stop this increase where it should have been stopped. Deputy, not now trying to close the door when it's gone.
Thank you now. Thank you now. Thank you now. Okay. Please. We're going on. Please, we're asking the deputies from Sinn Féin to respond, and Deputy Chris Andrews is sharing with Deputy Carthy and Deputy Doherty. Deputy Chris Andrews.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleagues for bringing forward this timely motion. In the past few weeks, we've watched fuel prices steadily increase. Petrol and diesel prices have increased by 7.6% and 9.9% respectively. This government seems hell-bent on ensuring that fuel prices hit the €2 mark as soon as possible. This government are planning 2 fuel hikes in October, and these price hikes are not happening in isolation. In the middle of a cost of living crisis, these prices are suffocating workers. These price hikes need to be stopped. It is ordinary workers and pensioners and vulnerable members of our society that will feel the brunt of these price hikes most. Some commentators say that these price hikes are needed to push more people to buy electrical vehicles, to push people to cycle and active transport. But the reality is that for the average person in Ireland, an electrical car is beyond their means. In the last year, the price of an electric car has jumped by 13%, and as a result, an electric car in Ireland now costs an average of €65,000. That's an enormous sum of money for ordinary people in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Last week I spoke to a young mother who works as a healthcare worker in a hospital here in Dublin. She told me why she doesn't use public transport despite having the choice. She said she goes to get to hospital, it takes her 20 minutes to drive versus over an hour on the bus. Getting to public transport every day would add over 7 hours a week to her commute. We need to see this government delivering efficient public transport so that we can ease the congestion we are seeing across the city and start improving the quality of life for those living in the city. Many communities across my constituencies, like Pearse Street and Kevin Street, experience constant traffic congestion throughout the day. Many times of the day, they're like car parks. So, simply because the government and DCC have failed to put in effective public transport. DCC slowing down the lights simply won't work. Garmalgad.
And Deputy Doherty for bringing this motion to the House, and
if I was in the humour, I might commend the Minister for managing to spend 10 minutes and avoid the very context of the motion in his own remarks. I recall not so long ago, on the 1st of September, Corla, when people realised that their petrol costs had increased by 7 cents per litre and their diesel costs by 5 cents per litre, there was a genuine sense of frustration among many people who I spoke to. And then when they realised that this wasn't anything to do with Ukraine, it wasn't as a result of a blockage of the Suez Canal, it wasn't as a result of any of the other litany of excuses that are put forward. This was a decision by government. And as one of my constituents said, Minister, as one of my constituents said, it was the equivalent of government putting a tax on a loaf of bread. Because this is the thing that some of you on that side of the House don't recognise. For people in my constituency, driving a car isn't a luxury. It is essential for them in order to be able to get to work, to drive their kids to school because they can't access school transport in some instances, or even to drop their kids at a football game. So when you increase the cost of doing those things at a time when people are already struggling with energy costs that have just gone beyond what was once even imaginable, with insurance costs, with housing costs, whether it be rents or whether it be in mortgage costs, with the increasing costs of groceries. What you are doing is actually making people's lives more difficult. And the suggestion made again that this is anything to do with environmentalism or climate action is laughable. And what is your current proposal right now, Minister? Your current proposal is that on the 11th of October, you will increase petrol by 2 cents and diesel by 2.5 cents. And what's your proposal after that? It's that on the 31st of October, you will increase petrol again by a further 8 cents and you will increase diesel again by a further 6 cents. And all of that happening, all of these increases are happening at a time when fuel prices are increasing on their own anyway. So that is what the net result of your current trajectory is. It will push families to the absolute brink. It will push many of them into personal debt crisis, even those who a number of years ago would have considered themselves to be well off. It will push businesses in my constituency out of actual business. So it'll actually, there will be a cost to the economy in many communities as a result of this measure, unless you take action. And what we do know is, because you've mentioned the measures you took in March, you've mentioned some of the other measures that government have taken, we know that in every single one of those instances, it took Pearse Doherty or another Sinn Féin TD to bring a motion before this House in order to embarrass you to take action. I hope that this motion has the same effect on you, and I hope that we will see real meaningful reductions in the cost of actually people travelling to their place of work. That's what people deserve, and that's what people are demanding in the budget.
Thank you, Can Corley, and I want to thank all the speakers who spoke in favour of the motion tonight, because it is a really important motion, and as many people have talked about, the middle of the cost of living crisis, so I'm not going to name all the parties. It was disappointing that I didn't hear from any of the rural independents because they weren't here to contribute to the debate, but I'm sure they'll have plenty to talk about later on in relation to those issues. But the key issue here, Can I
make a point of clarification? I came in here 22 minutes before I was to speak, and two groups before us hadn't spoken, so that's what happened.
And that's why I'm sorry that you weren't able to contribute to the debate, because I'm sure there would and that's why I pointed that I'm sorry that you weren't here to contribute to the debate, because I'm sure you would have a lot to add to it. So, Can Corla. But I do want to thank everybody for contributing to the debate and supporting the motion. The government obviously have tabled their own amendment, which is disappointing. And really, what we're trying to get at here, and I've raised these points with the Minister. You know, the Minister was shouting over to Deputy Carthy and saying, you supported this and all this. I can read you the transcripts, Minister. You're given the impression now that you set this date of the 31st of October because you wanted to review it. I put the question to you specifically at the Finance Committee, will you review this issue? Because if we remove excise duty from petrol and diesel at the current prices when we were dealing with the finance bill, it would be 191. But actually, if you continue along this trajectory, it will be at 196. I said it actually could go higher, and therefore if it crept up close to €2, would you be willing to review it? You said no. You said no. You said, and I'll read it out your own words if you want. You said no. You said, I am legislating for this. This is what I want to do. And then you caveat, we keep everything under review. But you said you are not keeping this. The point is, we have made it very clear that this is the trajectory it could have went, that prices could have risen in the international markets, which is what has happened over the summer period. We know the reasons for that. And now we're seeing petrol and diesel creep up to where I suggested it could do, up to €2. And you have decided not to send a signal here tonight in relation to the 2 increases that you plan. 2 increases. Not content with the increase in September, which the Dáil wasn't sitting to deal with, but a further increase of 2 cents and 2.5 cents on the 11th of October, and then a further increase again on the 31st of October. Many deputies here from border communities talked about the impact on individual businesses. Now, as I sat down with many retailers recently, and they come from some of the most deprived communities in our state, places like Lifford and Ballyshannon, places on the border. And the reality is, if there is a 10-cent excise duty and that's not reciprocated in the north through the British government, then it does make them unviable. Now, there is an issue here where maybe that the government aren't interested on the impact it will have around border communities, but there has to be an analysis in relation to what does excise duty do to businesses that are supporting jobs in areas that have got levels of deprivation that we don't see anywhere else in the state. At the core of this motion is a cost of living measure. The Minister was clapping himself on the back in relation to what they've done and what they've done over successive budgets. Minister, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, when inflation is still running at 6%, when prices are still going up, you're planning to put up the price of petrol and diesel. You did it in September, you're planning to do it on the 11th of October, you're planning to do it on the 31st of October, and that is madness as we creep up to €2 a litre at the pumps. So this motion is a sensible motion. It is about asking you not to proceed with that, to doing what I said to you back when we dealt with the finance bill at the early stage. If prices were creeping up at €2, then this needed to be kept under review. When you said no, I said this is exactly what has to happen. We're at that point now. These increases should not go ahead, and definitely not go ahead at this time. And I make the point again that this is another example of how out of touch this government is with where ordinary people are in terms of struggling with cost of living crisis. And I would just ask you to reflect on the fact that 1 in 8 people, 1 in 8 families can't pay their energy bill. How do you think they're going to feel when you increase the price of petrol twice in the next month?
That concludes our consideration of the motion.